Xenoblade Chronicles is an action role-playing game developed by Monolith Soft for the Wii in 2010. It follows the story of Shulk and his sword, the Monado, set on a quest to take revenge for the death of his friend, killed by a rivaling race known as the Mecha. Xenoblade's focus on gameplay comes in the form of a real-time fighting system where the player selects special attacks called arts to perform, while repositioning themselves around the battlefield to get an advantage over the enemy. Other than combat, the game has a strong focus on exploration, and gives wide open areas to explore. With the brief overview of the game done, I'll now begin deconstructing it, describing it with the aid of game design theories such as MDA, core dynamics, and meaningful play. MDA stands for Mechanics, Dynamics, and Aesthetics. The meaning of each is described by the original paper as follows. Mechanics describes the particular components of the game at the level of data representation and algorithms. Dynamics describes the runtime behavior of the mechanics acting player inputs and each other's outputs over time. Aesthetics describes the desirable emotional responses invoked in the player when she interacts with the game system. To my understanding, mechanics refers to the objects, functions, and variables of the game. In the case of Xenoblade, I find that it will be easier to break things down into separate smaller segments for this. I'll start with the party. Each party member is an object. It contains data and functions related to itself. These can be from their model file, animations, voice acting, to the functions that allow them to equip armor, walk, and take damage. There are a total of 7 playable party members in Xenoblade. Each one contains a set of basic statistics, these including level, HP, ether, strength, EXP, etc. Each party member also contains the list of arts they can perform. These arts can also be set as active so they can be used in battle, as well as having the ability to level them up by spending a party member's AP. Stats and arts are not just limited to the party, however. Each NPC that can fight, such as enemies and allies, also contain a list of arts and stats that they can use. Other stats that a party and NPCs also store include their position, direction, and speed, as well as the model file and animations for each art they use. Enemies, however, are not identical to the party. Some examples of mechanics include the paths that the enemies move, becoming aggro to the party under specific conditions, and the AI used to fight the player, as well as what their method of movement is, flying, swimming, or walking. Some less combat-orientated examples of mechanics include the day, night, and weather cycle. This is done by the map file, containing a current time, current weather for the map, as well as a list of possible weathers that could occur. The player has the ability to change the time by waiting, but not the weather. This, to my knowledge, is somewhat random. The map file also contains information on its model, and things like the location of enemy spawns. Other instances of mechanics would fall into quests. Each quest contains reward, description, and in most cases unique dialogue for the NPCs. Quests also contain a completion requirement that is usually tracked with the use of an integer variable. More complicated quests, such as the main quest line, contain triggers for cutscenes, boss fights, and other such things. Completion of quests also acts as flags, allowing for previously locked quests to become active or previously active quests to become locked. Lastly, I'll go over the mechanics of player inputs. The player has the option to jump by pressing B and to run around a 3D space using the joystick, going faster the further the joystick is pushed. Using the rightmost joystick will reposition the camera, and pressing Y will open the menu, which can be navigated using the D-pad and selected using A. Combat can be initiated by locking onto an enemy by pressing R, and the arts can be selected in the same way as the menu. Movement changes depending on the terrain. Whereas on land, the player can walk, run, and jump, while on ice, the player slides. While in water, the player can't jump, however they can swim at varying speeds, in much the same way they can walk at varying speeds on land. Using these mechanics, I'll now talk about dynamics. Dynamics consist of what the player can do to influence the game through their inputs, and the reaction the game gives back to the player from their perspective. An example of dynamics falls into combat. Using the mechanics of enemy aggression, player movement, and position, as well as the knowledge of enemy arts, the player can set up a situation in which most of the party are avoiding damage. This can be done by having Rhine, the tank, take the enemy's attention, whilst the rest of the party reposition themselves to avoid taking damage, standing at the side or behind the enemy. Other dynamics that arise from combat can include the difficulty of a fight. This uses the mechanics of player and enemy level differences, as well as any number of the preparation-based mechanics, such as selecting and leveling up arts, developing skills with a skill tree, or just equipping new armor. Though this mechanic is less direct, it is however reactive to the player's inputs. A player can go into the fight with nothing equipped and struggle, or prepare and go in with a plan allowing them to have an easier fight. The main narrative arc of Xenoblade can also be considered as a dynamic. It uses the mechanics of NPC dialogue and all the attributes associated with quests, whilst only being displayed to the player at the moment the player completes the objective of the quest. This can also summarize all side quests, while allowing for a similar dynamic using the same mechanics to form, the creation of a living, breathing world. This is done through another mechanic, where upon completion of a quest, or talking to an NPC, new relationships between the party members and between citizens can form or change if there already is one, eventually branching into a large net. This living world or reactive world dynamic can be considered as such due to the game and NPC behaviors changing depending on who you side with or what quest you choose to complete first, again using the flag mechanic of quests. This can open new areas to explore or allow for NPC characters to become more than just quest givers. Lastly, for dynamics, I have chosen player customization. This is allowed through mechanics like choosing what arts the player wants to use, what armor and gems the player wants to have equipped, as well as who they want to have in their active party. This allows for a large number of different strategies and playstyles to be utilized. With those dynamics said, I'll now move on to the game's aesthetics. Aesthetics in MDA refer to a specific set of taxonomies broadly describing how a player will experience the game. I've decided that the game could be broken down into 5 of these taxonomies, these being fantasy, narrative, discovery, challenge, and expression. My evidence from these choices comes from the mechanics and dynamics I described above, however some quick examples are as follows. Fantasy. The game allows for what is basically magic, as well as putting you in the role of someone who is fighting a great threat. Narrative. The game has an overarching story, as well as a detailed world with lots of smaller stories to discover throughout play. Discovery. The game has large maps that encourage exploration, with side quests that push the player to explore the farthest reaches of said maps. Challenge. Each area has multiple obstacles for the player to either fight or avoid. Sometimes these are optional and lead to secret rewards, other times they unlock new paths or just act as a fun way to demonstrate skill. Expression. The player can customize their party, allowing for a multitude of different ways to fight and play, using specific party members whilst choosing which skills, equipment and arts they want to use. With MDA done, next is the core dynamic of the game. In the article Core Dynamics, a key element in instructional game design, writers Carl Kapp and Sharon Boller describe core dynamics in 2 ways: what makes the game itself fun, and the how of winning that game. From the taxonomies listed, the closest one that I find that fits Xenoblade is exploration. I don't however think this is correct, and instead comes in some form of dynamic that must be added. If I was to use their second description, the how of winning that game, I would instead say that the core dynamic is most related to Xenoblade's combat. That said, it would fall somewhere along the lines of domination over the enemy. This is due to the combat being one of the main focuses on the game, where fights must be completed before you can move on with the story, and if we are to assume that the completion of the game counts as winning, finishing the final fight would be the how of winning Xenoblade. I'll now be going over some instances within the game where meaningful play is present. Meaningful play refers to the choices the player makes and whether they have an impact on the world around them. There are 2 types of meaningful play, descriptive and evaluative. Descriptive play comes in the form of actions made in the moment. Using Zimmerman's book, Rules of Play as an example, he states, meaningful play in a game emerges from the relationships between player, action, and system outcome. Examples of these in the game come in the form of decisions made in battle, what arts to use, where to position yourself on the battlefield, and how to influence your party's behavior. A more direct example comes in the form of one of Xenoblade's mechanics, visions. The game signals to the player that they will die in a given amount of time, and it's left up to the player to find a way around this. This can be done through healing a party member over a threshold, going into a defensive stance, disabling the enemy's attacks, or killing them before the time is up. Evaluative play, however, are actions made in advance. Another quote from Zimmerman's book is the relationship between actions and outcomes in a game are both discernible and integrated into a larger context of the game. These outcomes are not instant, unlike descriptive. You aren't reacting to anything to make these decisions. Examples could fall into the equipment you wear into battle, or who you want to fight alongside. As well as these examples would be choices made in each quest and multiple completion requirements. Who will you side with, or what task will you do first? The result of these can and most likely will influence the gameplay, as well as the overarching narrative of the world later down the line. That concludes meaningful play, and with that I've now covered all the theories I set out to from the start.